My name is Robert L. Green, and I am a professor emeritus of Michigan State University. And I was born and raised in Detroit, Michigan. Undergraduate work at San Francisco State College, bachelor's and master's, and PhD at Michigan State University.
So one of the kids, so these questions were sent by kids who read your book. They wanted to know what drove you initially to have such a passion for education.
My dad. My father was a person who loved education, and when he finished the 4th or 5th grade, he asked his dad if he could have one more year of formal schooling. And my father said, no. My grandfather rather said, no. You have to go out in the field and work and pick cotton like everybody else. So my father, of course, obeyed his dad, but within, my father always had a passion for education. And so that's all I heard as a kid growing up. It wasn't a matter of whether or not you were going to go to grade school, or middle school, and high school. There's no question you were going to do that. And I was thinking just the other day that, Ralph, my father had a stroke, but he was still able to drive the car with one hand with a stroke. He drove the car from Detroit up to East Lansing to make sure that my wife and my 2 sons and myself, I was 2 sons at the time, were okay at Michigan State, doing well in school. So my father always had a passion for education, and he instilled that in his 9 children.
That is crazy dedication, and that's wonderful. And you guys, if you haven't already checked out his book, this is Dr. Green's book, At the Crossroads of Fear and Freedom, the Fight for Social and Educational Justice. There's a link in the chat, and we'll also have it in the video as well. If you haven't read it, definitely check it out. It's an awesome, awesome book. First-hand account of US and world history. Very interesting read. One of our students, they wanted to know, well, I'm going to let Raul ask this question. Raul is in Spain. Raul, when you get a second, can you unmute and go ahead? You had a very good question for Dr. Green. You can ask whenever you can.
Yes. So after learning about Dr. Martin Luther King in a lot of my courses, and actually also at school, so he seems like a huge inspiration. So what was it like to have known him? I wish I knew him. What was it like?
Well, Dr. King was a very common, acting, plain person. He never pretended and never behaved as if he was very important. But we all knew that he was important. We all loved him, and we were always a little afraid that something would happen to him. I didn't think it would happen like it did, but Andrew Young, who was one of his close friends and workers, and myself, we were talking about it the other day. I never thought King, in a way, I thought King might be injured or hurt, but I didn't think it would come so early. But again, Martin Luther King Jr. was a plain, down to earth person who believed in nonviolence. He did not believe in retaliation, and we knew that. We knew if you worked for him, you had to be willing to endure pain, conflict, and misery. As we say, it's misery was something that you knew you had to experience because King would not fight back. As a matter of fact, uh, you might remember the name. You might remember the name Julian Bond. He was a black political person who was not allowed to serve politically because he refused to participate in the Vietnam War. And a group of us protested, were planning to protest at the Capitol in Atlanta. As we were going up the steps, a state highway patrolman with a club in his hand came to hit me like that. And as he began to hit me, I put my hands up to block the blow. So the blow would hit my arm and not my head. And on the front page of the paper the next day, there was a big picture in the Atlanta Constitution. It looked as though I was hitting the state trooper. Actually, I was blocking the blow. And Martin Luther King Jr. called me. He used to call me Bob. He said, Bob, do you still believe in nonviolence? I said, yes, sir, I do. Even if I hadn't, between you and I might have said yes. But I said, yes, sir, I do. And I'll practice it. He said, well, you look at the front page of the paper today. And I did. And it looked as if I was hitting a state trooper, which was not true. I was actually dodging a blow. So King was one who very deeply and strongly believed in nonviolence as a strategy, I think. And also, I believe he believed it in his heart to do things the right way and not hurt people.
And that's wonderful. And he had, the message of the reoccurring element in his speeches. One of our students has a question about that, but I'll ask that in a second. Right now we have Elisa in Italy, and Elisa, you should be able to unmute to ask your question. You had a very good question for Dr. Green.
Hello, I wanted to ask, what is your most vivid memory of Dr. King?
My most vivid memory of Dr. King? Oh, that's a very good question. Let's see. I remember being in his office and he was talking about nonviolence. And we received, his secretary came in the office in a very hurried manner. Her name was Dora. Dora said, Dr. King, I want you to know that James Meredith, I believe Meredith, has been shot, injured. And King was very calm. The rest of us was excited about what had happened, but King was very calm, and we prepared to go over to Memphis to see James Meredith and visit him in the hospital. But King was always a very calm, measured person. I never knew him to yell at anybody, to fuss at anybody. He would talk to you in a very nice, decent way, no matter who you were, or no matter how bad we thought you were. King always looked for ways to find the decency in people, and maybe that's why he lived as long as he lived. He lived only 39 years, but I often felt that his life was in danger, and eventually he was killed. And he was killed when he was trying to do the right thing from a nonviolent standpoint.
You had told me a story about Dr. King that you guys didn't want him to carry money on him. Can you kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Repeat that again, Ralph. Please.
About how you guys didn't want him carrying money. I found that to be a very fascinating story about that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
About him carrying money. He was very generous. If Martin Luther King, we would take money from him, because if he had $20 in his pocket and there was a man standing on the corner begging, King would give him $20. And we would say, don't give him all the money, give him just 10 and you keep 10. He said, no, I don't need money. He said, if I'm hungry, you guys are gonna feed me. If I need an airline ticket, you're gonna buy it. What do I need money for? He needs it. So King was a very generous person. And I remember that about him. So what we would do when we would travel, usually Bernard, who was one of the young men who traveled with him, would be the one who would carry the money. Because we knew that if somebody was on the street corner begging, hungry, and needed the money, Martin Luther King Jr. would give them the money. And he would say, I don't need it. You guys are going to take care of me. People are going to feed me. What do I need $20 for? And he would give it to the person begging on the corner.
That's an unbelievable story. That's nowhere in the history books. And I love that. And thank you for sharing that with us. So one of our kids emailed me. They wanted to know, when you initially took your leave of absence at Michigan State University to assist Dr. King with his efforts down south, was this a difficult decision for you, coming from the north, knowing what you were going to step into in the south?
Well, I used to say, Martin Luther King Jr., when he signed me to Mississippi, he put me in charge of voter registration for the state. And my wife and two little boys, I think I had 3 little boys, were living in Atlanta. And that meant they would be alone. And I was a little concerned about leaving my family. So for almost 6 months, I was in Mississippi, back and forth, of course. I would get home on weekends. And I was fearful for my family. And you know, Ralph, one thing that I never did, and I mentioned this to Andy Young a short time ago, we need to talk to our living children about what they went through while we were in Mississippi. My son Kurt, Ralph, whom you know, Kurt told me he used to watch the news at night or in the evening when I was in Mississippi to see if I was okay, to see if I had been injured or killed. I never knew that. He just told me that, I'd say maybe a few months ago. So at some point, we need to do something on the children of civil rights workers and the impact that racism, discrimination, and brutality, as they saw it on television, had on them, and their worry about their parents. And my wife, I always thank my wife, Letty, because when I was in Mississippi fighting for social justice, she was home with those boys. And nothing ever really happened to her. And she said the only time she was fearful, she took my son Kevin out for a walk, and we live, Ralph, near a wooded area. And as they began to walk, a pack of dogs came out of the woods and had a very tough look on their face. And the dogs, the lead dog had been fighting. He was cut around, had been bitten around his neck. As and my wife said, as she and Kevin approached the dogs, a pack of about 8 or 10 dogs, Kevin, who was only 2 or 3 years old, went up to the lead dog and smiled and said, "Doggy, doggy." The lead dog started wagging his tail, and guess what? All the other dogs wagged their tail. But when my wife told me that story, it was very frightening. And so we need to, maybe part of young people, part of our research, we need to talk to people who are adults now, who are children then, about the impact that social justice had on them as young people.
And yeah, I couldn't agree more. And guys, again, check out Dr. Green's website. It's in the chat. There's a link for the book on there, and it's a very interesting story. I mean, you are one of the civil rights leaders of that time. You were with Ralph Abernathy, Dr. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, all of these major names, like you, Robert Kennedy, like you were firsthand witnessing history. We have a question from Francesco, sorry. Francesco, go ahead and unmute and you can ask your question.
Thanks, Dorf. About your association with Martin Luther King, there were surely some risks of this association, probably the police, your family.
So I'll help you interpret that, Francesco. Francesco wants to know, what were some of the risks when you went down south, or when you were associated so closely with Dr. King during that time?
Well, part of the risk was staying alive. You know, when you worry about yourself too much, sometimes that's not good either. I always assumed that eventually something would happen to me, and I wanted my wife and kids to be okay. So the risk, young man, was knowing that on any given day you could lose your life. And in those days, especially in the state of Mississippi, there was very little penalty. You didn't pay a person, if they killed a black, they were not penalized for it. Or they had a trial, like Emmett Till. When Emmett Till was killed, the jury found, the all-white jury found the men that killed him innocent, not guilty, I should say. So that was always a risk, and I knew that. And for some reason, I was really never really afraid. I think, Keith, there's one thing. Okay, I know. Speaking of fear, the one thing that Martin Luther King Jr. did for the Black community, later on for women in America, he taught all of us not to be afraid. He said, if you're fearful of your life, you might lose it anyway. So when I see a movement of young people today, or women, the women's movement, their ability to fight for social justice is related to the fact that they're not afraid to go to jail. They're not afraid to be fined. Years ago, they were not afraid to be beaten. And Black women were beaten too. And not just Black men, Black women were beaten with clubs. If you look at some of those little videos and tapes, you'll see policemen dragging, white male policemen dragging Black women through the street because they were protesting. Well, you know, to see that during that time, you felt a little helpless, Ralph, because you knew if you intervened, what could happen. I'll never forget, Martin Luther King Jr. this was after the bombing of the church in Birmingham. Martin Luther King Jr. was preaching, and 20 black men walked into the church with rifles. And King stopped preaching and asked, what are you going to do with those rifles? They said, we're going to go out and we're going to find 20 white men and kill them. He said, oh, so you go out and kill 20 white men. What's going to happen is this. The sheriff is going to deputize every white man in the county. They're going to go into your neighborhood, burn your homes down, beat your children, and you will have nothing. And they listened to him. He said, so we don't do it that way. We do it in a non-violent way. And King, again, preached about forms of protest and how protest should be, as much as you can do protest, done in a direct, non-violent, peaceful way. You don't use violence to fight violence. And that was something that always stood in my mind, that people who, during that time, as I look back now, white males who were fearful of blacks retaliated, especially black men. And you could not fight them because the sheriff had the whole county behind him in terms of law enforcement. But that wasn't the reason King was nonviolent. Martin Luther King Jr., more than anybody I know, and I mentioned this to Andy Young just the other day, Martin Luther King Jr. really believed in the importance of human life, the sanctity of human life. And don't hurt people, don't beat people, don't kill people. Enhance life. That's a good way. That's a new term, Ralph. I just came up with a new term, enhancing human life. That's what King believed in. King believed in enhancing human life, the beauty of human life, more than anybody I know. He would lecture us if he thought we were on the verge of being something other than nonviolent.
And you mentioned all throughout your book, you're talking about that. And I found it interesting how you kind of parallel Malcolm X's approach with Dr. King's approach. And I found that very intriguing. And, you know, albeit your short interaction with Malcolm X when they were speaking at Michigan State University, I found that very fascinating that you were there to witness that crossroads in history. We have a question, a couple more student questions. I'm gonna let you go. This is from Victoria. Victoria, you should be able to unmute and ask.
Yeah, I want to ask, what was the thing you appreciate the most of Martin Luther King?
I missed that, Ralph.
So she wants to know, what is the thing, as his personal friend, what is the thing that you appreciated most about Dr. King with the time that you spent with him?
The fact that he was not afraid to die. He was not afraid. He once said, if you're afraid of dying, you're not going to be successful. And overcoming the fear of death, that was a big deal in the Black community, because many Black people knew that if they crossed the line, especially a white male, could take your life and nothing would happen. So when I think about Martin Luther King Jr., I think about overcoming fear. And more than anything else, he was the person that allowed me and many others in the Black community. My dad was a fearful man. And I remember, here's an interesting story, and I don't know if I mentioned this in the book or not, Ralph. I had taken my dad shopping on a Sunday. When we came back, this was in Detroit, Michigan. I said, Dad, tell me something that you never shared with anybody else. He said, I really don't know anything. I said, Dad, come on, that's not right. Now I said, you're gonna tell me something. And so he said, okay. When my father was 12 or 13 years of age or so, he and his friend saw a group of white men, 35 or so, hang a Black man from a tree and took his life. My father saw this. And I said, well, what did he do? My dad said he did not violate any laws or do anything wrong. But whites in Jones County, Georgia, Haddock Station, every now and then would kill or lynch a black man to keep the other blacks in line. And I said, Dad, I was hurt. I looked at him, I said, Dad, why didn't you tell me this when I was a little kid growing up so I would know? He said, I didn't tell you, son, because of the way you were reacting now. He said, I didn't want you to grow up hating white people because all white people are not bad people. That was my dad's response. He said, the reason I didn't tell you when you were a young kid, I knew you would be angry. And I knew you would want to fight. And I didn't want that to happen. I wanted you to think and use your head. So my father was quite an interesting man. But when he told me the story of actually seeing a black man lynched, hung from a tree, when he was, I think, 13, maybe 12, 13, it didn't matter. He was a young kid. That, to me, had a very heavy negative impact on me as a young person.
You had mentioned in your book, you talked about your father, Thomas, mentioning about surviving and thriving. And that kind of, I mean, that story, I mean, it resonates and it makes sense why he would say that to you, that just survive to thrive. So we have a question from Luke, and I believe he's in the United States here, and he wanted to know how important was your faith and Dr. King's faith when it came to facing the challenges of that day?
Repeat that again, Ralph.
How important was your faith and Dr. King's faith when it came to overcoming the adversities of the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, our faith, how was our faith?
Yes.
Is that it? How was our
Yeah,
faith?
the role of faith during that time.
Okay, it had to be very strong because we knew that the system and people who ran the system were not good people. They did not treat blacks fairly. So you had to constantly deal with the fact that you're dealing with an evil system. And King would say, think about how you can change that evil system rather than being caught up in it and being afraid of it. And I'm coming back to fear again. I'll repeat this, young people. The one thing that Martin Luther King Jr., I think, did that no other civil rights leader did, he taught us not to be afraid and to fight for social justice. And he said, if you lose your life, you lose your life. So when King was assassinated, he was prepared for it. As a matter of fact, I can remember one, I think I might have mentioned this in the book. We were in Grenada, Mississippi. And I think it was Grenada. Well, we were in Mississippi, put it that way. And Martin Luther King Jr. used to like to pull the window down in the front and let his elbow hang out the window, especially in the summertime. And Andy Young and I were sitting in the back of the car. Coretta King's cousin was driving. And there was a man by the name of James Belk, B-E-L-K. He was the owner of a Texaco gas station. He saw Martin Luther King Jr. at the stop sign. We were at a stoplight, brother. And he ran up to the car and pulled out a pistol and put a pistol on King's forehead. I saw this. I was sitting in the back with Andy Young. He said, Martin Luther King Jr., I'm going to blow your brains out right now. King looked at him. He didn't flinch, with a big smile and said, brother, I love you. That pistol came down, and James Belk, this was at a Texaco station, put that pistol in his pocket and walked away. And I'll never forget, Andy Young said, Martin, why do you sit in the front of the car with the window down, knowing that someone might come up and kill you? Martin said, Andy, look, you worry too much. He said, John Fitzgerald Kennedy had the Army, the Navy, the Coast Guard, he named them all, Secret Service, And they got him. When they're ready for me, they're going to get me, and there's nothing you can do about it. And that had such an impact that he had resigned himself to the fact that one day he was going to take a bullet, and he did.
That is a chilling story, and it's also a beautiful embodiment to what he was about when it came to love and kindness. And so before we let you go for our final question, I wanted to ask, what advice would you give for these students when it comes to improving the world around them when they see a problem? You and Dr. King and the rest of the civil rights leaders, there was this element in all of these different speeches, this reoccurring element of love and kindness. What kind of advice would you have for these kids when they see a problem in their world about trying to improve the world around them?
As I look at these names, Emma, Victoria, Sophia, Marco, and Francisco, right?
Yeah, those are their first names. Yep.
Okay, what I want to say to them is always try to do the right thing. If you see someone on the street being abused, interfere, help them. If you see someone on the street hungry, find a way to feed them. I remember once I saw somebody on the street and I gave them some money, and the person with me said, "Don't give them the money. They might buy alcohol with it or drugs." I said, "I don't know what they're going to do with it. I'm not going to judge them, but I can tell that they're hungry." So when I gave the man the money, I said, "Sir, please buy some food." That's all you can do. If you're going to give money or give a gift to a needy person, you can't judge what they're going to do with it because you don't know. But always try to do the right thing yourself. So when you see somebody in need, it's hard for me to pass a hungry person on the street if I have a few dollars in my pocket. It's hard for me. And the reason, young people, that it's hard for me to do that is because I have so much. I get 2 or 3 meals a day, sometimes maybe 4. And to see someone who needs a meal, to me, is something that I can address, and I should address it. So in other words, social justice should always remain in our mind and always try to do the right thing. And as Martin Luther King Jr. would say, take care of the least of these. Those who cannot defend themselves, you help defend them. Men don't abuse women. Women don't abuse children. Children don't abuse other children. Always be fair.
That is phenomenal advice, sir. And we can't thank you enough for taking the time to speak to us today. This was truly the memory of a lifetime for a lot of us, and you truly are forever a world changer, Dr. Green. Thank you for all of your continuous work in education and social justice. Before I end the meeting for all, I'm going to allow everyone to unmute, and can we all say thank you to Dr. Green for taking the time to speak to us today. We can't thank you enough, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very much.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.